In the mid-1800s, Charles Darwin discovered the theory of evolution. He discovered that through a process called natural selection, what is more colloquially known as the concept of survival of the fittest, many species would undergo changes in order to adapt to their environment as a mechanism for their survival. Some theorists have taken Darwin's findings and used it to justify the competitive and hierarchical society we live in today. Whether Darwin's theories apply to our everyday lives and wider society is up for heavy dispute, however. So in this instalment we're going to be looking at two specific concepts. Those concepts are social Darwinism and mutual aid. I'm going to be talking about the origins of both, what they mean, and how relevant they are in terms of today and in the future. Social Darwinism started gaining traction in the late 1800s and was popularised in the first half of the 20th century. Proponents of social Darwinism tried to apply Darwin's theory of natural selection to human societies. One such proponent was Herbert Spencer, who gained much of his ideas from his readings of Thomas Malthus. Malthus believed that since human populations exponentially grow, a struggle for resources is inevitable. To simplify, social Darwinists believed that society and the individuals living within it should behave as aggressively competitive and individualistic as possible. So, what would a social Darwinist dream society look like exactly? Throughout the late 19th century, there was a period of time called the Gilded Age, which kick-started America's Industrial Revolution. While it was a time of economic expansion, with railroads and coal-fired power plants popping up everywhere, it was also a pretty dark time in US history. Air pollution was on the rise, and working conditions were next to Spartan. Most of the wealth created in those times went into the hands of a small few businessmen who dominated the US economy. The government at the time was ineffectual at regulating industry, because the small rich few bought and controlled the government of the time. Many workers had to put up with long hours and abysmal working conditions, and when many of them revolted, they were executed by private security. From a social Darwinist perspective, the entrepreneurs of the time would be considered the strongest of society, since they were able to amass huge quantities of wealth, and thus were deserving of their fortunes. And the workers at the time would be considered weak, because their bosses were effectively able to establish dominance over them. It wasn't until the early 1900s, when Teddy Roosevelt got elected, that the Gilded Age came to a fortunate end. Were the massive fortunes attained by capitalists and the suffering of the workers during the Gilded Age really necessary? Does social Darwinism really hold up? Sure, in nature, we see many species that are highly competitive and follow the textbook example of survival of the fittest. However, there are also many species that survive not by competition or tribalism, but instead by cooperation, the most notable of which are bees and ants. Enter the philosopher Peter Kropotkin. In 1902, Kropotkin wrote Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution, in which he argued that mutual aid has pragmatic advantages for the survival of human and animal communities, and even goes on to state that mutual aid has been promoted by natural selection. But what is mutual aid? In organizational theory, mutual aid is the voluntary reciprocal exchange of resources and services for mutual benefit. In contrast with social Darwinism, mutual aid implies cooperation instead of competition. Rather than focusing on individual and biological factors in our evolution, the theory behind mutual aid looks at natural selection through a social lens. Proponents of mutual aid might even argue that the survival of a species is linked to the survival of its societies. So then, what are some examples of mutual aid? One of the most commonly employed forms of mutual aid present today is the social contract. We give a small portion of our labour to a governmental body, which in return might provide things like healthcare, education, social security, and so on. Not all parts of the world have this, but for those that do, it provides a great social benefit. This isn't really ideal, since you're entrusting a hierarchical power to provide you with these benefits, but it's much better than nothing at all. With all that said then, do humans and human societies fundamentally follow the principles of social Darwinism or those of mutual aid? The short answer to that question is, well, kind of both. While a lot of primitive societies were mostly cooperative and egalitarian, humanity has also lived through feudalism and capitalism, which are by contrast competitive and hierarchical. Humanity is capable of being cooperative cooperative or competitive, or even mixes of both as we see in today's social democracies. We've lived through the Gilded Age, and more recently have seen the rise of neoliberalism, but also historical examples such as revolutionary Catalonia, and even today in Rojava, show that people like to cooperate just as much as they compete, if not more so. The question to answer then is less about whether humans have an incline towards mutual aid or social Darwinism, and more about which principle would generate the most positive outcomes when applied to society. In this regard, social Darwinism doesn't really have a lot going for it. When applied to society, it often creates quite undesirable outcomes, such as poverty for a large number of people. Social Darwinists hold that the most physically, mentally, and emotionally strong individuals will inevitably rule over society, but as I'm about to explain, that hypothesis isn't really consistent with reality. By social Darwinist logic, people like Albert Einstein and Usain Bolt should have ruled the world by now, but that clearly hasn't came to fruition. Today we have people like Donald Trump, who despite barely being able to read, has amassed huge amounts of wealth and power. If you judge people's strength and importance based on how much wealth they can accumulate, then you'd be intellectually discarding many of the influential philosophers, scientists, and workers that have advanced and maintained society up until this date. Moreover, social Darwinism doesn't take into account the specialization of labor and diversity of skills in different people. In order to be a chef, you need to have at least some culinary skills. You might not be the world's fastest runner, and you might not know the first thing about programming, but a chef doesn't really need those proficiencies. Their time would be better spent doing what they love and what they're good at. A big problem with social Darwinism, arguably its biggest flaw, is how it doesn't take into account that strength and weakness cannot be objectively quantified. They are highly subjective variables. If I played sport, for example, I might do better at golf than I would at basketball. That doesn't make me objectively stronger or weaker than other sports people. It just means I'm stronger at golf and weaker at basketball. Comparatively, superfluously wealthy people are not necessarily stronger in any way than the rest of the population. They just have a knack for accumulating large quantities of wealth and have no greater importance than people like doctors, teachers, or firemen. In fact, societies can work without a wealthy overclass just fine, as examples I have previously given in this video show, and therefore I see no reason why we should continue to pursue a society that values a wealthy elite with higher priority over people who make vital contributions to mankind. When we look at the principle of mutual aid, we can see it has brought a great deal of good to society. Since the establishment of the United Nations after the Second World War, the world has since enjoyed relative peace, because nations were willing to come together and collaborate. Because of the existence of the social contract, we have created a number of organisations that bring a huge benefits to society, such as my homeland's National Health Service and the North American Space Agency. If social Darwinists had their way, people like Stephen Hawking wouldn't become the prolific scientist that he was. But because of the existence of the National Health Service, he was able to get the support he needed so that he could indeed become one of the great minds of the world. This proves that cooperation and helping others instead of leaving them behind has a knock-on effect of benefiting society as a whole. As part of mutual aid, this is called reciprocity. Today, individuals, as in workers and business people, contribute something to their society. Society then does things to benefit individuals, and the cycle goes on and on. I guess that one way to view mutual aid is as a symbiotic relationship between the collective and the individual, with each of the two consistently contributing to one another. Ultimately, when the collective and individual neglect each other, decline will soon follow. However, when the individual and collective embrace each other, then both will flourish. This is why I believe having a society based on the principle of mutual aid is a better alternative to a society based on a socially Darwinistic ethos. And that is all from me today. Join me next time when I talk about how our environment shapes our behaviour. I will talk about things like preconditions, scarcity and abundance, and how we can apply that knowledge in creating a resource-based economy. With that said, thank you for watching. If you want to see more content from me, make sure to subscribe and click on the little notification bell. Sharing the content I produce will help the channel gain exposure and will raise awareness of the ideas being presented. Also, if you're interested, you might want to check out some of my other videos. But for now, this is Adam Jones, signing out.